Please, let me stay. I'll cook and clean. The cowboy's answer changed my life forever. Before we begin, take a moment to write in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, settle in and enjoy the story. She stood trembling before the wooden gate, clutching an old canvas bag as if it held the last fragments of her life. The Wyoming morning lay heavy under a blanket of fog, and the only sound was the mournful howl of wind sweeping across the prairie, stretching out like an endless lament. The cowboy pushed open the stable door, its hinges groaning in the silence. His boots thudded against damp planks, spurs striking with a sharp, lonely rhythm. In the dim light, the horse's breath rose in silver clouds. Then her voice broke the stillness. Please, let me stay. I'll cook. I'll clean. At that moment, the horizon burned red through the fog like a wound spreading across the gray sky. The desert wind rose, carrying with it a cutting chill. The cowboy's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, the instinct of a man who had lived too long alone on the untamed frontier. But this time, that solitude quivered, shaken by a plea, and from that instant on, nothing would ever be the same. He had lived with loneliness until that morning. Wyoming, at the turn of the century, a land set apart where a small town lay hushed beside a rusted stretch of railroad. The saloon at the end of the street no longer heard fiddle music, only the creak of shutters slapping in the wind. Beyond that stretched the desert, where sandstorms swallowed footprints whole. Out there, folks were used to the sight of one solitary figure, Jonas McGraw, 40 years old, a cowboy who earned his keep driving cattle for nearby ranches, his boots forever caked in dust, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing a sun-scorched brow, and his eyes steady, guarded, holding stories no one dared ask. Jonas was not a man for chatter. He worked more than he promised. That morning, the fog hung thick over the prairie, the weak gold of dawn just barely glinting across the weathered boards of the ranch. Jonas bent to drop hay into the trough, the horse's hooves striking slow, steady, beats like the heartbeat of the barren land itself. And then he heard it. Footsteps, soft but certain, not belonging to anyone on the ranch. Jonas looked up, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Through the gray haze, a slender figure began to take shape. He did not draw his gun. He did not move closer. He only stood there, a strand of hay still clinging to his glove, listening. Suspicion stirred inside him, but so did something else, a habit carved deep into every man of the West. Caution, because in these parts, no stranger ever showed up without carrying a secret. In that suspended moment, with the breath of fog curling, with the desert wind wailing like ghosts, and with Jonas's gaze steady on the stranger, time itself seemed to hesitate. Loneliness had long been his only companion, but that morning, loneliness cracked. If you were the cowboy riding into this town, what would be the very first thing you'd do? Part 1. The Unexpected Encounter. It was early morning, when the sun had yet to pierce the veil of fog, and the prairie lay as though caught in a cold, unending dream. The grass had turned gray, heavy with dew, and the wings of migrating birds cut across the sky before vanishing into the mountains. At the weathered gate of the ranch, a small figure emerged, as if stepping straight out of the mist. The woman looked frail, her clothes worn thin, patched and fraying at the seams. Her long hair was matted by the damp of night, hanging across half her face. In her thin hands, she clutched a canvas bag not much larger than a pillow, but heavy with the remains of a life left behind. Her breath rose in trembling clouds, dissolving into the morning wind. Inside, Jonas McGraw led his horse into the yard, the weight of his boots striking spurs against the wet earth. He lifted his head, his eyes hard and sharp beneath the brim of a wide hat. A stranger on his land at this hour, out here, that was never ordinary. The silence was so thick it carried only the sound of the horse's breath, the rhythm of man and beast merging into white clouds of vapor. Jonas slowly set down the feed bucket, his hand flexing an old reflex of caution. He'd grown used to strangers showing up with debts at their back. Or worse, trouble, but her eyes were different. Though red and swollen from sleepless nights, somewhere inside them glimmered the faintest spark of hope, like a tiny flame flickering in a long winter night. That single spark kept Jonas from turning her away. He stood still, watching, while the hardened heart of the West inside him skipped a beat. The woman took another step. Her shoes, split at the seams, soaked up the frost. Dark, wet prints marked the ground in her wake. She lifted her gaze, restless yet resolute, as though she knew if she let this moment slip, there would be no other place to go. Her voice came trembling, but every word cut into the silence of dawn. Please, let me stay. I'll cook. I'll clean. No pretense, no poetry, just the raw truth of someone who had reached the end of the road. Jonas did not move. Her words echoed in his mind like nails driven into dry timber. He had long watched women abandoned, immigrants stumbling at the rail yard, girls who worked themselves ragged for pennies and couldn't even afford the train home. But few had ever dared look him straight in the eye and say such a thing. His gaze darkened not with anger, but with memory. Years ago, his own mother had once stood outside a stranger's gate, clutching a canvas sack, begging for shelter. That vision pierced him now like a blade driven backward into his chest, leaving him breathless. The woman still stood there, knuckles white against the strap of her bag. Before her, one nod could change her world. One shake of his head, and the last door would close forever. The fog thickened. The wind whistled through the fence. Jonas's heart beat slow, heavy, like the fall of a hammer. Instead of answering, he turned away, scattering hay into the trough, letting silence stretch between them until it felt unbearable. Silence can weigh heavier than rejection. The woman lowered her head, time dragging like an endless rope. Each hoofbeat sounded like the ticking down of fate. Jonas did not look at her, but his mind was restless. In the West, mercy could be a trap. A stranger might be a decoy, a lure leading wolves to the door. Yet, if he turned her away, tomorrow he might hear of a woman's body left by the tracks, and her face would haunt him forever. The smell of horsehide and hay filled his throat, bitter as ash. Memories surged. At 20, he had once helped a woman like this and paid the price with sleepless nights, fearing betrayal. But the desperate fire in this one's eyes began to fracture the wall he'd built around himself. At last, he turned back, stepping toward the porch. His eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, without a word, the loneliness and harshness of two souls touched like two wounded animals meeting at a stream. The woman swallowed hard, holding her ground, though fear trembled in her limbs. She waited for his judgment, knowing her life now hung in the hands of a stranger. Jonas studied her closer. Her hands, though thin, were scarred and callous, the hands of someone who had worked without rest. Faint scratches and bruises marked her arms. Her coarse dress was so worn, a strong wind might tear it apart. The truth struck him clear. She wasn't here to beg, nor to deceive. She had labored, been beaten down, yet still had enough left to stand. He drew a deep breath. The question came rough in his mind. Why did you leave? Her lips trembled. That single question stripped away the last of her armor. Her voice cracked as she spoke, of a harsh employer, one who treated workers like shadows, paid little, struck when anger rose. She had endured until nothing remained to endure, each word carved into Jonas like an old wound reopening. He'd seen it too many times out here. Law was paper thin, and the weak bore the burden. When she finished, her eyes glistened, though no tears fell, not because she refused, but because she had long since wept herself dry. To Jonas, she looked nearly broken, but unyielding, and that image rooted itself inside him. Silence fell again. Jonas tapped his hand against the bucket, his gaze unreadable. The woman lowered her head, bracing for rejection. Instead, he set the bucket down, stepped closer, and stopped within arm's length, where the wind cut between them. His voice was low, gravelly, forged in silence and iron. If you don't mind working, the kitchen's inside, the broom's in the corner. The words carried no promise, no comfort, yet for her, they were salvation. Her eyes lit wet with fragile joy, her lips trembling into a smile uneven, but bright enough to warm the cold morning. Jonas turned, walking back into the ranch without a glance behind. But each heavy step told him what he already knew. From this day on, his life would never be the same. He had opened his door to a stranger, and with it, cracked open the fortress of solitude he had guarded for years. Across the prairie, the fog began to lift. The first thin rays of sunlight spilled over the fields, catching on her damp lashes until the tears shimmered like jewels. It was the light of a beginning, fragile, but real. Part 2. The silence of judgment. Morning light slipped through the fog, falling across the weathered porch. The damp boards glimmered faintly, reflecting pale streaks of gold, as if even the sun hesitated to step into the harsh world of the west. Jonas stood still, his shadow stretching long across the wood, merging with the cracks of the old planks beneath him. The woman dared not step forward. She stopped just below the porch, eyes fixed on the tips of her torn shoes, clutching the canvas bag against her chest. The air seemed frozen solid. Even the prairie wind outside the ranch gate felt as though it had been stopped at the threshold. From above, Jonas looked down. His eyes swept from her hair, damp with dew, across the patched fabric of her dress to the calloused hands that trembled against the bag. All of it told the same story. She had worked, suffered, and endured without anyone to shield her. He asked nothing. He said nothing. He simply watched. The silence hung like a blade suspended overhead, every second stretching into a sentence. The woman bowed her head deeper, her breath shortening. Her heart pounded as though one turn of his back would cast all her hope into nothingness. Jonas tilted his head, glancing at his horse. The beast exhaled white vapor, tossing its head as though sharing in its master's suspicion. Only the saddle creaked softly as Jonas shifted his weight. The silence was no accident. For Jonas, silence was a test, a way to measure whether the soul before him had the patience and the truth to withstand its weight, or whether she would falter and flee. But she did not flee. The woman stood trembling, every shiver fueled by cold and dread. The cowboy's figure loomed above her, unmoving, like a statue carved from stone. She longed to lift her head, to meet his eyes, but fear pinned her gaze to the ground. Her fingers clenched the bag straps so hard the knuckles turned white, ready to split. Memories returned in cruel flashes, the shouts of her old master, tasteless meals of bread and broth, nights of shivering without a word of kindness. All of it had driven her here to this gate, to this moment where her fate hung suspended. Jonas did not speak. He let the silence do its work. In the West, a promise was only worth making after long consideration, and mercy was a gift not given lightly. He read the signs written on her body as though they were lines in a book, calloused hands ragged patches, eyes torn between fear and desperate hope. A gust swept across the porch, rattling the boards. She shivered, her vision blurred with cold tears that refused to fall. Yet, in her wet eyes, there flickered something fragile but firm, a small flame refusing to die. Jonas caught it, and for an instant he saw his mother long ago, trembling outside a stranger's gate, begging for a place to rest. The memory cut him deep, his chest tightening. Still, he held his tongue. Silence was the last fence he kept between himself and the world, and now it stood between him and this stranger. The horse stamped, breath heavy, its hooves striking the earth like the ticking of a clock, counting the heartbeats of both man and woman. Jonas stroked its mane, his eyes never leaving her. This silence was not only for her, it was for himself, too. Could he open his door to another soul and shatter the walls he had built so carefully? He had grown used to loneliness, to nights filled only with the wind across the desert, to solitary meals at the long wooden table. A stranger in his home meant change, and change meant danger. The woman seemed to sense his struggle. Her chest rose quickly with each breath, her eyes glistening, her heart racing. But still, she did not run. Each second she stood was a wager of all she had left her dignity, her trust, and her life itself. The light fell across Jonas's face, a muted gray gold. His eyes narrowed, steady but haunted. He looked through her, not at a beggar or a broken woman, but at a reflection of his own past. Someone always left outside the door of happiness. The horse whinnied softly, lowering its head to the grass, breaking the silence for a heartbeat. Yet the stillness between man and woman remained, heavy as a duel without guns. Jonas stepped down one creaking board of the porch, closing the distance. Now, he saw the bruises half hidden beneath the thin cloth of her sleeve. He knew them well. They told their own story, one harsher than words. Blows endured, worth denied, a life discarded. The woman's eyes lifted once, brushing his. In them was not only fear, but a plea small, fierce, and unmistakable. She wanted to be seen, not as labor, not as burden, but as human. Jonas inhaled deeply, the air thick with horsehide, wet wood, and cold mist. He knew if he turned her away, those eyes would follow him forever, a ghost reminding him that once someone had needed him and he had looked away. But to open the door was to open the fortress he had built brick by brick. His heart, used to armor and distance, now trembled as if it might betray its own laws. The sun climbed higher, cutting through the fog, striking her tears until they glimmered like dew. Jonas swallowed hard. He turned, hiding the tremor in his throat. His fist clenched as if to hold the wall inside him from breaking apart. Time stretched, unbearably long. She waited, trembling, balanced on the edge of despair. One nod or shake of his head could send her crashing down. Jonas stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing against the light. In the silence, he heard his own heartbeat, the cry of a raven in the distance, the whisper of the desert wind. Everything urged him to decide. He looked at the mountains, at the sun, rising to tear through the fog, spilling across the prairie. She still stood there shaking, but unyielding, and Jonas knew she was not here to exploit. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. Their eyes met across the heavy air, hers wet with unfallen tears, her lips trembling, his shoulders locked as if carved in stone. The moment stretched so long, it felt as though the world itself would collapse if silence lasted any longer. At last, Jonas exhaled long, heavy, like a man laying down a burden. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He simply turned, stepping inside the house, leaving the door open behind him. It was another silence, but this time, a silence that carried acceptance. The woman stared, her eyes flooding, her grip on the canvas bag loosening. That door, the door of a hardened cowboy, had opened just enough for her to enter. And in that fragile instant, as the sun broke through the fog, two lonely souls had brushed against each other for the very first time. Part 3. The story unveiled. Jonas's cabin lay in half darkness, lit only by the fire that licked against scarred wooden walls. The smell of burning pine mingled with the bitter steam of coffee rising from a blackened pot that hung on an iron hook. On the table sat a skinning knife and an old brick-colored bandana, like everything else here. Plain, quiet, and built to endure. Outside, a horse snorted and stamped, while the wind rattled the window panes, carrying into the cabin the eternal whisper of the West. She sat at the edge of the chair, not daring to lean back. Her rough hands rested on her knees, calluses catching the firelight in dark lines. Jonas poured her a cup of coffee, the bitter drink that carried warmth from the borderlands. He set it on the table, half a hand's breadth away, not too close to intrude, not too far to dismiss. "What's your name?" Jonas asked, his voice low, even like the leather reins worn smooth by desert wind. She lifted her head slightly. In the firelight, her face looked hollow, but strangely dignified. "My name is Mara." The name came out hard, as if it had been buried under years of dust and just dug free. She rubbed her hands together, then wrapped both palms around the cup, drinking in its heat as if it were a fragile promise. Jonas didn't press her. He pulled out a chair and sat at an angle, letting the flames paint both their faces. Silence in this cabin wasn't emptiness. It was a kind of shelter, giving space for words to find their own way. Mara's eyes fell on the canvas bag by her feet, its strap frayed open like a wound. "I came from Harrison's camp, east of the rail line," she began. "There, workers are like shadows. Nobody remembers your name but yourself." She paused, drew in a long breath, then went on. "I was there 3 seasons. Cold, heat, and then cold again. After the 3rd, I left." The fire flickered across her face, casting light and shadow in turns. Mara bit her lip. "I didn't leave because I was lazy. I left because when a place turns people into objects, you have to walk away before your soul forgets its voice." Jonas gave a slow nod. Outside, his spurs still carried the dust of the trail, a reminder that a cowboy's life was only another endless road. He picked up the small knife, let its steel catch the firelight, then set it down again, signaling that tonight, this house spoke only in words, and so Mara let her story burn in the firelight instead of in fear. She told of mornings at 4, when she rose to stoke the stove, haul water, sweep out ash, knead dough for bread. By the time the sun cleared the barn roof, her hands burned raw, as if pressed against iron. She told of binding hay, patching clothes, scrubbing yards, laundering blankets for men who never once said thank you. She told of the rank smell of horse sweat that clung to her hair, of whole summers without a single bowl of warm water for her own hands. When they called, I had to answer. When I was sick, no one came. Jonas tapped a steady rhythm on the table with his fingers, like the slow beat of hooves on hard dirt. "What kind of man was Harrison?" he asked. Harrison didn't shout. Mara replied, "He just didn't look." And not looking, sometimes, is worse than striking. I stood right in front of him, yet it felt like I was behind glass. I asked for my wages. He gave me half. I asked for rest when I was ill, he said. "Harvest won't wait. You..." Sometimes he walked past me like I was a post. Her eyelids reddened in the fire's glow. One day, the new cowhand asked me my name, and I froze, Because it had been so long since anyone cared, I answered slow, afraid the syllables might break if I said them aloud. She smiled faintly, not with joy, but with the sad recognition. There, a name was a luxury. Jonas said nothing. He knew neglect well. It was like desert sand, not sharp, not loud, but it wore a person down all the same. Mara's hands clenched tighter around the cup. That first winter night, I burned with fever. Still, I rose to light the stove because bread had to be ready by dawn. I collapsed at the kitchen door. Harrison passed by, paused. I thought he'd help me up. Instead, he lifted the tray and said, "Don't let the dough go flat." And then walked on. The words fell heavy in the cabin, like a stone dropped into a deep well. Outside, the wind wailed along the railroad, carrying the sigh of coal cars that had long since passed. In the west, some wounds bled without blood quiet, invisible, but weakening all the same. That was the kind of wound Mara had placed on the table tonight. She spoke of June, the laundry girl whose hand was crushed in the press. She opened her mouth, but no sound came, like a fish gasping on dry ground. I rushed, pulled the lever, blood spilling. Harrison stood at the doorway, hands in his pockets. He said, "It's lunch hour. Be quick." Mara pressed her fingers against her face, holding back tears. I tore my sleeve, bound her hand. June whispered, "Sister, I don't want to die here." I smiled, told her she wouldn't. But inside, I knew every day in that camp was a death in slow pieces. From her bag, she pulled a small handkerchief, once white, now yellowed with age. A crooked J was stitched in its corner. "June gave me this the day I left. She said, 'So you'll remember someone once called you sister.' I kept it to prove I was still a person, not a shadow." Jonas stared at the fabric, its uneven stitches straight in their own way, like a road rough but leading home. He remembered his mother's kerchief, tied each morning before heading into the fields, carrying the scent of sweat and sun. Mara's voice dropped lower. She told of a winter night, of a foal injured by bent iron. She tried to calm it, but Harrison beat the animal with a whip. I stepped between. His blows struck me instead. Still, I told him, "Don't hit, it's afraid." He whipped harder, as if punishing defiance itself. The fire cracked, sparks leaping like the memory of lashes. Jonas leaned forward, feeding another log into the flames. He offered no apologies on behalf of another man. In the West, apologies were cheap. Comfort came in firelight, in food, in calling someone by their name. Mara finished her tale. If I'd stayed one more season, I'd have become an empty space that could work, an emptiness that needed no name, no dreams. I left because I was afraid that one morning I'd look into water and see nothing at all. She folded the kerchief back into her bag, tucking her fragile heart inside it again. Jonas understood. Courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a woman standing still beneath the lash to shield a frightened foal. The last day at Harrison's, she asked for her wages, half pay, as always. But she told him her name Mara. She listed every task she'd done, every place she'd worked, and he laughed, like a man hearing a cat ask for a coat. He pushed her kerchief aside like crumbs. "No one makes you stay," he said. "The railroad's that way." She didn't cry. She took the half pay, turned her back, and walked into the wind. At the door, the gust nearly knocked her down. But she stood. She left on her own 2 feet. Jonas swallowed hard, the bitterness sharp in his throat. He knew that taste, the taste of leaving behind a place that should have been home. "And where did you go?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "Toward the tracks. I sat near the stalls where they sold pastries. The smell of cinnamon, like a holiday that never came. I sat there until evening, and nobody looked at me. Freedom felt a lot like being invisible. She gave a brittle laugh, dry as a matchstick burned to its end. When the sun went down, I told myself, if I didn't find a porch to lie under, I'd sleep by the tracks. And if I didn't wake the next morning, no one would know. For a moment, the fire seemed to breathe with her words. Jonas rested his hand on the rough wood of the table. But you came to my gate, he said. Because I saw light in the stable, Mara replied. A fire that looked like eyes willing to listen. The fire popped, shadows trembling on the walls like tired horses shifting after a long ride. Jonas stood, filled her cup again, then his own. They sat across from one another, the wooden table now holding the shards of 2 lives. In this ranch, Jonas said slowly, there aren't many rules, but the fewer the rules, the more they matter. His eyes shifted toward the door, where the wind pressed through cracks. Anyone who eats here works like family, and anyone who works like family is called by their name. Mara held her cup tighter, lips trembling, eyes no longer hiding. All I ask is a place to call home, she said softly. A place where, if I put this kerchief on the table, no one will push it aside. She set it down in the center of the table, not as a challenge, but as a prayer. Jonas stared at it. The letter J shone faintly, small but stubborn, like a hook clinging to the edge of a cliff. He reached out not to take it, but to touch its corner, the way one might lay a hand on the reins of a horse weary from the trail. Enough to say, I see you. I mean, no harm. Tomorrow, he said, you'll light the stove at 4. I'll feed the horses at dawn. At noon, we eat here. I'll call you Mara. You'll call me Jonas. And if anything goes wrong, we use words. I won't have ghosts in this house. Mara nodded. This time, the tears fell quietly, like heavy dew that could no longer cling. Thank you, she whispered. It's been so long since anyone wanted to call my name. Jonas went to the cupboard, brought out a chipped porcelain bowl and a half-warm loaf of bread. He broke it in 2, setting half before her. Eat, he said. In the West, trust begins with breaking bread. She lifted the piece. The smell of fresh dough rose like a memory of lullabies long lost. For a moment, the cabin wasn't just 4 walls. It was a porch against the wind. Outside, the desert still howled, the rails still moaned like the sigh of travelers gone. But inside, there was the sound of spoons against bowls, of slow chewing, of fire hissing like a whispered song. It was the music of the West, not loud, but true enough to be remembered. Jonas slid the kerchief back toward her. Keep it, he said, and when you wish, place it here again, so I'll know. This house has 2 names. Mara pressed it to her chest and, for the first time that night, leaned back into the chair, no longer perching at the edge. The firelight reflected in her eyes, twin rails of silver cutting across the plains. Somewhere at the end of those rails was not just a nameless station, but maybe, just maybe, a porch where someone would call her home. And in Jonas's small nod, a cowboy who spoke more with deeds than vows, Mara understood. Beginnings don't always arrive with declarations. Sometimes they arrive with a steady seat, half a loaf shared, and a name spoken without fear. That night, when Jonas rose, the faint jingle of his spurs rang against the floor like a promise. Not a promise of love, not yet. Just the promise of work shared, of bread baked, of lamplight glowing at dusk, enough to call each other by name. Part 4. The Unexpected Decision. The kitchen sat in the back of the cabin, its wooden walls cracked with age, smoke mingling with the strong scent of coffee simmering in a black iron pot. Western mornings were always cold, but this morning's chill crept all the way into Mara's bones. She sat at the rough wooden table, eyes fixed on an empty cup, not daring to think further than her next breath. Jonas entered, his heavy boots leaving damp marks across the floor. He said nothing, only poured coffee. The bitter aroma spread, filling the room. It wasn't the fragrance of luxury, but of habit of mornings, of calloused hands needing warmth before labor began. He set the cup before her. The faint clink of ceramic on wood rang louder than a bell in Mara's ears. She looked up, eyes still weary, at the cowboy's rough hand, the hand that had gripped reins, hauled hay, fired shots in the night. Now, offering warmth to a stranger, Jonas remained silent. His gaze met hers through the veil of steam, not harsh, not gentle, but steady, the eyes of a man who knew the cost of every choice. In that moment, Mara couldn't tell if she was on trial or being spared. Her fingers clenched the strap of her bag. The silence pressed too hard. Finally, she whispered, "If you need me to go, I'll go. Just give me a few hours under the porch until the fog lifts." Jonas drew a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling. Then he spoke, voice low, gravelly, each word falling like iron. "The kitchen's in there. Broom's in the corner." For a heartbeat, Mara didn't understand. Her ears rang as if all sound had been swallowed by the prairie. No, yes. No, no, just a simple line. But to her, those words fell like rare rain on desert dust. She blinked. "You mean?" Her voice broke, unable to believe. Jonas didn't repeat himself. He turned, dragged out a chair, sat, and poured his own cup. In his world, words were sparse. A short answer was enough. Opening the door meant acceptance, nothing more needed saying. Mara bit her lip, tears welling not from pain, but from release. The weight in her chest cracked apart. She was no longer a shadow cast from the rail yard. She had been given a place to begin again. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Jonas didn't answer. He only nodded, his eyes fixed on the steam rising like desert clouds. In his gaze was something heavier than pity, a wordless covenant, the kind only a cowboy would make if he let someone stay. He wouldn't abandon them. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup, heat flowing into her bones. She lifted it, breathing in the bitter scent. She had never truly tasted coffee, only smelled it from afar in Harrison's camp. Today, that smell marked a turning, from invisible to seen. Outside, sunlight pierced the small window, spilling across the floor. Dust motes floated in the beam, like fragile traces of hope. Mara still trembled, but for the first time in months, it was not fear. It was the tremor of acceptance. Jonas sat quietly, fingers turning his cup. Wind battered the walls, chains clinked in the stable. His heart beat harder than usual. The words he'd spoken had been few, but inside, they cracked the wall he had built for years. This ranch had never known the footsteps of a woman, never seen cloth laid out on the fence to dry. Everything had stayed in its place. Cold meals, polished guns, horses fed on time. Order was his armor, solitude his shield. But now, with one sentence, he had opened the door to change. His eyes lingered on Mara. She still clutched her cup, shoulders hunched, tears slipping into the rising steam. The sight pulled at a memory. His mother, after a long road, slumped by a fire, crying quietly with no one to hear. A memory he thought buried, rising now like smoke in his chest. Jonas clenched his jaw, drawing in through his teeth. He knew he couldn't take it back. To let her stay meant sharing not only his roof, but the silence that had been his alone. Mara lifted her head at last, eyes wet, meeting his. For a moment, their gazes burned like two torches, finding each other in the dark. No vows, no promises, only truth. They saw one another. This silence was no longer a sentence. It was a companion. And in that small kitchen, with the wind howling outside. A cowboy let his loneliness fracture just slightly. Mara rose. Her steps creaked across the floorboards as she walked toward the corner Jonas had pointed out. There stood the broom, leaning against the wall, its handle coated with dust. She lifted it, gripping the wood like she was grasping a new beginning. She swept the floor, each stroke loud in the stillness. Jonas watched, struck by the strange sound. A home long filled with wind and silence now echoing with the rhythm of life. She bent to the hearth, hands trembling, but sure, coaxing fire into dry wood. Flames leapt, crackling bright. Warmth spread. Mara stared into it, tears falling again, not from despair, but from the realization she was tending a fire for a home, not for men who saw her as nothing. Jonas didn't interfere. He only watched, silent, feeling the cabin change. A stranger was making it a home. Soon, the scent of bread dough on iron filled the kitchen. Mara worked carefully, every motion nervous but hopeful. Each movement carried the caution of someone afraid to lose her place, yet also the fragile trust of someone finally being seen. Jonas tapped his fingers on the table. The rhythm steady as hoofbeats. He knew, from this moment, the ranch was no longer his alone. It now held two hands tending the fire, and a home, sometimes, began with nothing more than that first flame. When the food was ready, she set it before him. Her hands trembled, eyes searching his face. If he refused, she would not belong. Jonas lifted the spoon, ate slowly. His expression barely shifted, only a small nod, but that nod was enough to break her. Mara turned her face away, tears spilling hard, her sobs silent but raw. Jonas set the spoon down, his eyes holding hers. "From tomorrow," he said, voice even, "the kitchen's yours. The horses are mine. At noon, we eat together. After, you help me mend the fence. No sweetness, no promises of comfort." Yet for Mara, it was the first contract she had known in the West. No signatures, no witnesses, only the quiet word of a cowboy. Outside, the sun rose higher, washing the prairie gold. The smoke from the chimney curled into the sky, carrying with it the scent of food and fire. The horse snorted in the corral, as though announcing a new beginning. Mara looked at her bread, uneaten, tears still wet, but inside, for the first time, she felt peace. She did not have to walk on. She had a place to sweep, to tend, to live. Jonas gripped his coffee cup. He spoke no more, but in that silence, Mara heard it a vow unspoken. He would not let her fade into a shadow. The moment was plain. No touch, no embrace, yet it shifted their fates in a kitchen of coffee and bread. A cowboy had opened his door, and a woman had found a place to belong. Part 5. A new beginning. Midday sunlight spilled through the small window, laying pale golden streaks across the rough wooden table. Inside the cabin, for the first time in years, a new sound filled the air. The steady rhythm of a knife against a cutting board, echoing like the heartbeat of a home. Mara stood by the stove, hands moving swiftly as she chopped vegetables. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the scent of frying fat and burning wood. Her hair, tangled but soft, caught a glimmer of sunlight. Against the wall leaned the broom she had used earlier, standing upright like a quiet marker proof that a woman's hand now tended this place. Jonas sat at the table, his fingers laced, eyes fixed on every motion she made. He wasn't used to another presence in his kitchen. Each strike of the knife, each step of her feet, stirred a cautious unease. Yet in his watchful gaze flickered something else, an unwilling curiosity. Outside, hooves struck the ground, wind hissed through the fence, but inside, it was the sound of chopping and the crackle of fire that claimed the silence. The West's harsh air seemed softened by it. Mara knew he was watching, but she didn't shrink. For the first time, his look no longer felt like judgment. It was the way a man might look at fire on a cold night, silent, steady, grateful it was there. She raised her head, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. It was brief, but strong enough to rattle the wall of silence between them. Mara lowered her gaze, knife still working, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jonas sipped his coffee, face unchanged, though deep inside, he knew the cabin was no longer empty. The stew filled the room with its aroma, bread smoking on the pan. Mara placed the pot on the table, her hands trembling. She feared one frown could undo all she had worked for. Jonas took the spoon, lifted a bite, and ate slowly. His face remained steady. Mara sat opposite, hands clenched in her lap, waiting. At last, Jonas gave a small nod. Just that, but for Mara, it was the greatest gift she could receive. Tears welled and slipped onto her hands, even as a smile broke through. "Good," Jonas said simply, his voice rough, as if one word carried the weight of winter. They ate in silence, but this silence was no longer sharp or heavy. It was the pause between notes in a song, giving each space to feel the presence of the other. Outside, the prairie blazed in noonday light, glinting off the abandoned rail line. Inside, two souls who had lived unseen shared their first meal. For a cowboy, used to loneliness, and a woman once treated like a shadow, that meal was proof they had stepped halfway into each other's world. Jonas set his spoon down, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "This afternoon, we mend the fence," he said. Mara nodded without hesitation. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. And so, in that cabin, an unspoken pact was sealed. They would work together, eat together, keep silence together. From these plain things, fallen sayings connect. Forkeis yam. A home began to take shape. By afternoon, desert winds blew dry and fierce, carrying red dust into the air. Jonas swung the hammer, each strike echoing like thunder. Mara held the wire taut, her hands bleeding from splinters and thorns. Jonas noticed, said nothing, but eased the force of his blows, enough for her to keep hold. Sweat ran down their backs, the sun burning their skin. Yet this labor was different. Each post driven, each line of wire pulled, was built together. Mara's breath came hard. Her hands shook, but her eyes were bright. She no longer worked under the lash of fear. She worked to belong. When the last wire was set, Jonas stepped back. He offered her a canteen. She drank deep, water spilling from her lips. Jonas reached out and brushed the drop from her chin. A small gesture, natural, unplanned. Mara froze, heart pounding, her wet eyes rising to his. Jonas pulled his hand away, turning to the fence as though inspecting it. But inside, that touch carved a crack in the wall he'd lived behind, letting a little light seep in. Mara understood. She had been accepted, not in words, but in deed. Evening fell, painting the prairie in coals of red. The fence stood tall, and though they were worn, something inside them felt unbroken for the first time. Trust fragile, but real had taken root. That night, they sat on the porch, a lantern casting yellow light across the cabin walls. Insects hummed. The wind sang low through dry grass. The horses breathed slow in the dark. Mara hugged her knees, staring out. "I used to think my life would end beside the tracks," she whispered, "where no one remembered me, where no one called my name. But today..." Her voice faltered. Jonas sat silent, his gaze fixed deep into the prairie night. He didn't comfort with words. He simply listened, and that listening broke her tears loose. For the first time, her past was allowed to exist in another's hearing. At length, Jonas spoke. "I thought this ranch would bury me alone." He took a sip of cold coffee. "But this morning, There was the sound of a knife in the kitchen, a fire on the stove. I realized I'm not alone anymore. Mara turned, eyes blurred, and looked at him. Two broken pasts, sitting together. Their silence wrapped them like a blanket against the desert wind. The lantern flame trembled, gold light resting across their faces. Mara smiled through her tears, the first unforced smile in years. It felt as natural as fire burning steady on the hearth. Next morning, the rooster's crow echoed across the fields. Fog lifted, and dawn spilled gold along the porch. Inside, the stove already smoked. Mara worked at the fire, her eyes bright with morning light. Jonas stepped into the doorway, saddle in hand. He paused, watching her small figure bent over the stove. Something stirred in his chest, strange, quiet, but deep. He had never imagined this ranch holding such a sight. Mara turned, met his gaze. They shared a small nod. No words, yet in that nod was a vow. To face the new day together. He stepped into the yard to feed the horses. She turned back to her cooking. Knives on wood, hooves in the dirt, whined through the fence, all blending into a new rhythm, a rhythm of two lives. When they sat at the table, sunlight broke through the window, glinting off Mara's damp lashes. Jonas looked once, then lowered his gaze to eat. But inside, he knew yesterday's decision had changed not just her life, but his. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and unforgiving. The rail line still moaned. The desert still bit hard. Yet in the cabin, a small fire had been lit. The fire of a new beginning, fragile, but enough to chase away a lifetime of solitude. Evening, golden light draped across the weathered fence, shining like embers on old wood. In the cabin, the warmth of supper lingered, the smell of bread and coffee clinging to the air. Jonas stood at the porch, leaning against the post, eyes sweeping the fields. Wild grass swayed, endless and gold. Out there, Mara hung a cloth to dry, her hair lifting in the breeze, like a flame flickering in the vast prairie. The moment was plain, no gunfire, no vows, just a woman hanging a cloth and a cowboy watching. Yet in that quiet lay the greatest truth. A new beginning had come, and both knew it, though neither spoke it. Jonas's hand tightened against the post, sealing a choice he could not undo. He made no promise of protection, no pledge of forever, but the way he stood, watching her hair in the sun, that was his promise. I see you, and I am here. Mara turned, eyes meeting his. No smile, only a nod, but it was enough. The air of the west, always so heavy, cracked open to let in something softer trust. The setting sun gilded the cabin as if in gold. Far off, a train whistle cried, reminding them of other roads, other fates. But Jonas didn't turn away. His eyes stayed fast on the woman who had made his lonely ranch breathe again. A cowboy, a woman once invisible. Now, two lives had found each other on a land that promised nothing but wind and dust. And sometimes, a simple yes is enough to change two destinies.